you a bit so that you are properly framed. You are a little bit sitting low. I need to have your full face and your shoulders in the picture because we are going to have labelings on the broadcast. So we're going to use your name at this part of your screen. Now, if you are sitting low, the name will end up being on your face. Please ensure that you are framed. There's a small space just ahead of you, above your head. Yeah, just like that. Can I also request a colleague that is assisting Madam Paula Cooper to also do the same, please? She's sitting at the corner at the moment. We need her to be centered in the picture. Can I kindly remind all the honorable guests and participants that the session today is going to be streamed live on various social media platforms. And therefore, we request you to ensure that your videos are turned on all the time, especially when you take to the podium to speak. You are allowed to switch off your microphones when you have not been given an opportunity to speak. The session will also be recorded for later broadcast on DSTV channel 408, which is the Parliament of South Africa television channel. It's found on DSTV and it's channel 408 as I indicated. That is where we are going to be broadcast later on. But we are live streaming the session on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. So we request you to take that into consideration when you are participating in the session today. I'm not seeing Mr. Moses Owo. Is it possible for you to switch because the light that's coming out from behind you is making your face to be a little bit darker? Is it possible to switch around and ensure that all the light sources are coming from in front of you, not from behind you? Because that sort of obscures your picture. It's a little bit much better now. Thank you. Mr. Guambe, your room is a little bit dark. Is it possible for you to switch on the light there?
Let me see if it's possible. Okay.
Thank you. Colleagues who are assisting Madam Paula Cooper, please ensure that she's centered. She's at the corner of the picture. Thank you very much, Miss Maria Rosa, for the picture. Very good. Mr. Miguel Brito, thank you very much. My colleague, Natalie, thank you very much. Good quality picture there. Good morning, Honorable Dennis Namacheka.
Good morning. It's Namachekecha. Namachekecha. That's Malawi.
Oh, sorry. Namachekecha. How are you, sir?
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The camera is a little bit too close to you. Is it possible to move it away from you for like a centimeter or so? That looks a little bit better. Can we move it around a bit so that you are at the center, in the center of the picture? There we go. There we go. Let's try to leave a little bit of space just above your head so that there's some white line showing there so that we don't cut your head. No, don't open the window. Don't open the curtain. That's fine. That's fine. Thank you. Thank you very much. I think we are fine with all the cameras that have been switched on.
Can we talk about interpretation?
Yes, you can, please. Yes, you can. Thank you. Were you saying I should talk about it, or you were going to talk about it?
Yeah, kindly proceed, Modise.
Oh, sorry, sorry.
No, that's cool.
Sure. Thank you very much, honorable participants. The session is going to be broadcast in 3 SADC PF languages, Portuguese, English, and French. For interpretation purposes, when you scroll at the bottom of your screen, there will be an interpretation section there. You click on it and then you choose, you'll see that there are 3 languages. You choose the language of your choice. Either you want the interpretation in English, French, or Portuguese. If you are using a mobile device, I think when you scroll to the bottom, you'll find an icon that says more. That is where you'll find interpretation, and you can choose the language of your choice. You have an opportunity to choose whether you want to mute the original language or keep it going as well. I think it's advisable to mute the original. Actually, it usually is advisable to keep it that way, so that when the person that speaks your language speaks, because there wouldn't be an interpretation in that language, to keep it that way. Yeah, I think, are we all together and happy? I'm happy from my side. Just a quick reminder again, the session is going to be broadcast live on our social media platforms, that is live streaming on the SADC PF social media platforms, which is Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube, and also live streamed on the Parliament of SA social media platforms. And I'm not sure if the colleagues from the IDEA are actually streaming as well, but it should be available on those platforms. And then we'll be recording this session for later broadcast on Parliament TV, which is found on DSTV channel 408. The broadcast will be done later today. Thank you very much for that. Mr. Kurasha, over to you.
Thank you very much, Modise. We appreciate the housekeeping procedures. Now we hand over to Mr. Matenga, to Graham, to take us through the meeting.
A very good morning, everyone, and welcome to this webinar. Bon dia, bonjour. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we can hear you.
My name is Graham Matenga. I am with International IDEA. I'm the head of office for Kenya and also the regional thematic lead on political participation and representation for Africa and West Asia. So before we proceed, allow me to recognize the participants who have constituted this meeting, honorable members of parliament from different parliaments across Africa, the Secretary General of SADC Parliamentary Forum and her team, officials from parliaments across the continent here represented, parliamentary experts and other democracy and governance experts who are also represented here. My colleagues from International IDEA, ladies and gentlemen. So welcome to this meeting once again. This is a consolidation of the discussions that we have been having in partnership with SADC Parliamentary Forum, which is our partner is International IDEA, and other institutions on the impact of COVID-19 to on parliamentary effectiveness. So before we proceed with the discussion, with the presentations, allow me to just encourage us to mute our mics, unless if you have the floor to speak. During plenary session, you can raise your hand if you want to share your contribution, and or also utilize the chat box. The raise hand function is on the reactions button. at the bottom right end screen of your screens. So thank you once again and welcome to this webinar. May I now call upon the Secretary General for SADC Parliamentary Forum, Madame Biemo Sekweme, to give her opening remarks.
Graham, maybe before Madame Boemo Sekoma takes the floor, let me confirm that French interpreter is allocated ICT. I see a comment that there is no French interpretation from one of the participants.
Ronald, can you attend to that, please?
French is indeed assigned.
Maybe then we may request the honorable participant to select the French option on the interpretation so that they are able to access interpretation. French interpreter, can you hear me? Thank you very much. With that, we can hand over to the SG. Thank you, Graham.
Thank you. Over to you, SG.
Good morning. Good morning, Director of Ceremonies. Allow me to pay respect to our distinguished VIPs who are with us today. Let me recognize Dr. Roba Sharomo, the Regional Director, Africa, West Asia at International IDEA. Let me also recognize our honorable members from the SADC Parliamentary Forum and chairpersons of the standing committees that are represented here today. Allow me to also recognize the representatives of regional and international organizations who are present with us this morning for this important session. Also allow me to recognize our friend of the forum from GIZ, Dr. Adani Gebremeskel. Also let me recognize our partners from civil society organizations that are present today, representatives of the media in your diversity, also recognized staff of the national parliaments who are practitioners in the parliamentary framework, and staff of the SADC Parliamentary Forum. Allow me to just say, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen. Honorable members and distinguished participants, it's with immense pleasure and honor that I appear today in my capacity as the Secretary General of the SADC Parliamentary Forum to make these opening remarks on this theme of paramount importance in Africa. I wish to state at the very outset that the responsiveness and resilience of parliaments in times of crisis have been one of the first issues flagged by the SADC Parliamentary Forum following the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic. And I thus wish to thank the International IDEA for cooperating with the forum in view of further developing this theme in the form of a continental study. Indeed, parliaments, which have a constitutional mandate within the context of a clear separation of powers from the judiciary and the executive, cannot fail, especially in times of crisis when their functions are vital and crucial for democratic governance. If parliaments, which are at the helm of the state, were to fail during crisis, then this would be an abhorrent to the rule of law. good governance, and would further endanger the operations of the state. It's very important for us to always focus on the role of Parliament during such crises. In fact, when crises beset, which affect communities and constituencies, citizens naturally turn to parliamentarians, and thus parliaments, to act as safety nets and to find immediate solutions that can be forthwith implemented. The Continental study made through country case studies is thus necessary in view of garnering the input from honorable members and all relevant stakeholders who work directly or indirectly with parliaments. Director of Ceremonies, I wish to emphasize that it is during crisis that it is necessary to enact emergency legislation, pass urgent budget items, and exercise oversight in Parliament over emergency measures taken by the executive. While COVID-19 has certainly left its trail of lessons, parliaments have been at the center of crisis management in Southern Africa since their existence. From resolving civil strife, to managing the end of apartheid, to taking climate action, following devastating cyclones, or mitigating the global financial crisis, parliaments have always been in the spotlight of conflict management and resolution. With the outbreak of COVID-19, national parliaments have been compelled to rethink about resilience strategies and to ensure a continuity in operations. I am confident that the views that will be discussed today will relate the overarching and fundamental principles that constitutionalism can never be put to rest. Likewise, parliaments do not rest and are always working to achieve desired objectives in crisis mitigation. In the SADC region, some parliamentary sessions have stretched for almost 24 hours, with resuming of work within a day to ensure that appropriate legislation is passed on time to deal with COVID-19 situation. While often stakeholders and citizens consider the end result, that is the law that is enacted, less attention is paid to the hard work invested for the law to be processed through the necessary parliamentary stages. We have therefore learned a lot of lessons. On the main, lessons that have been decanted in that respect is that all facilities and logistics need to be provided as a guarantee for parliamentarians, as well as administration of parliaments headed by the clerks, secretaries general, to function effectively. COVID-19 has demonstrated that the operations of parliaments must not be restricted in any respect, especially because parliaments operate a potentially 24/7 service. While I do not want to preempt the deliberations of today, I'm confident that you will wholly agree that parliamentarians must be given the necessary facilities and equipment to engage constructively on bills, on motions, and parliamentary questions, such that there is a balanced debate in the House, in particular when Parliament sits to resolve crises. There's also need for a clear resilience and preparedness plan. Honorable members and distinguished participants, before I end my remarks, I would like to re-emphasize that parliaments are at the center of the democratic framework of each and every state in Africa. There can be no democracy without parliaments. When the Forum released its statement on the International Day of Democracy earlier this year, it highlighted that The felicitous work conducted by SADC parliaments within their respective democratic framework has cushioned the devastating effects of COVID-19 and has enabled the region to embark on a progressive path of economic recovery. Indeed, we must continue on this path of recovery. And this can only be done if we have a clear resilience and preparedness plan from parliaments to operate in times of crisis. The Continental study report marks the beginning of this process. I will accordingly like to encourage you today to engage with one another frankly in view of distilling the Continental study reports and recommending same for adoption. As you are aware, there's no guidelines for Parliament pandemic preparedness yet, let alone a set of guidelines for crisis preparedness. Still, we have no choice than to move in that direction, since we want to promote parliamentarism as well as interparliamentary cooperation, both of which are fundamental. Apologies. Both of which are fundamental in the work that we do, especially to the African democratic framework. In ending, honorable members, today, as we discuss this Continental reports, we mark history by standing together for the noble cause of the resilience of parliaments. Pursuant to the deliberations of today, we hope earnestly that the findings of the Continental report would lead to appropriate guidelines that can prepare parliaments for crises and conflicts to come in the decade ahead. The next time, we shall be fully prepared and democracy will no longer suffer. On this note, I thank you for your kind attention and wish you a pleasant session. Thank you, Director of Ceremonies.
Thank you very much, SG. I think you raised very pertinent issues which the study will need to take into consideration as well, as we try to make a compelling case on why the effectiveness of parliaments during crisis. You raised the issues around, plans, the need for plans and guidelines for parliamentary effectiveness during crisis, which I think is very important. So thank you once again, SG. May I apologize on behalf of the Regional Director for International IDEA who couldn't be here. He wanted to be here, he still new at IDEA, so he wanted to be here, but there was an emergency which required him to travel today. So he has delegated my colleague, Miguel De Brito, who is the head of program for Mozambique, to represent him. Over to you, Miguel.
Thank you very much, Graham. Good morning, everyone. As Graham indicated, Dr. Sharamo is right now flying over somewhere in Africa on his way to the Gambia. Unfortunately, he won't be able to be with us as he wanted to. So he asked me to deliver some remarks on his behalf and on behalf of International IDEA. Honorable members of Parliament present in this webinar, Madame Buemo Sekoma, Secretary General of SADC-PF, my colleague Dr. Jonathan Murphy, Head of Inter-Paris Program at International IDEA, my dear friend Shonele Kurasha, SADC-PF Program Manager for Democracy and Governance, esteemed members of the study team led by Professor Lovemore Matuku, my dear colleague and friend Graham Matenga as moderator of this webinar, dear participants, all protocol observed. We are here today to conduct a review this very interesting continent-wide study on enhancing parliamentary effectiveness in Africa during crisis. And this is a study that brings together two of International IDEA's main pillars of activity. On the one hand, production of knowledge, and on the other, parliamentary support. And so for that, this study for us embodies what IDEA does and what IDEA loves to support. Crises such as the COVID-19 pandemic are a challenge for any government system, and democracy is no exception. Parliament is obviously recognized as the core institution of representative democracy, and therefore its capacity to continue performing its core duties during crisis, it's not only a test of its own resilience as an institution and as a body, but is also a test of the strength of the democratic system itself. The pandemic has led to the adoption, in many cases, of very stringent measures by most governments across Africa. And these measures, although they are necessary to mitigate the spread of the coronavirus, they have also given extended and exceptional powers to the executive branch of government, consequently creating unique challenges for the performance of parliamentary roles and functions. These functions in these times of COVID-19 have included passing laws needed to address the pandemic, but also laws that don't undermine the fundamental democratic principles and Parliament's own role as the oversight body. They also include providing effective oversight of executive action to ensure that in addressing the pandemic, governments do not overreach. And it also includes representing the voices of citizens, especially those made more vulnerable by the pandemic. The separation of powers and the interdependence between branches of government in Africa are already fraught with challenges under normal circumstances. Under a crisis where executive powers have increased exponentially and for such a prolonged period of time, this relationship has suffered an additional strain in many contexts. And this requires examination and self-reflection, which is what this study does. And this is even more important when we witness a decline in the quality of democracy worldwide, which is an issue of great concern for all of us. Since the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, International IDEA and its partners have convened dialogues and generated knowledge products on the impact of the pandemic on democracy and governance, including on Parliament and its functions worldwide. As a part of that effort, in 2020, in partnership with SADC-PF and CDD West Africa, International IDEA convened a webinar on the impact of COVID-19 on parliaments on the continent, bringing together representatives of regional parliaments and legislative bodies. One of the key outcomes of that webinar was the need for a continental study that would provide recommendations on enhancing African parliamentary effectiveness during crisis, cognizant of the fact that there are limited guiding frameworks at regional and global levels to that effect. This study, whose findings we will examine today, was ably led by Professor Lovro Matu and a team of African experts, whom we would like to thank in advance for this groundbreaking piece of work and an exemplary case of Africans producing knowledge on Africa for Africa. We, as International IDEA, are deeply honored to have played a small part in it. We look forward to a critical review of the report findings and recommendations, and hopefully its adoption at the end of this webinar. And good luck with your discussions and deliberations today. Over to you, Graham. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Miguel. I mean, your remarks complement very well, the presentation from the Secretary General of SADC Parliamentary Forum. You will notice that on the program, there was supposed to be a presentation from Dr. Jonathan Murphy, who is the head of our flagship program called Inter-Pares. It's a global program to support parliaments across the globe. He wanted to be here to share some perspectives around the knowledge product that he led to put together on the impact of COVID-19 and on parliamentary effectiveness across the globe. So, but unfortunately, he got sick. So, but I mean, this is a platform that he was looking to participate on. Unfortunately, he got sick, but we'll utilize his submissions on the overall report. So in terms of the format of the presentation of the report, what we are going to do, we had initially shared the program that had Professor Maduku come in first, then country experts to lead the presentation of their case studies later. But we have kind of switched that. So we'll have our country experts to present the case studies, 7 to 9 minutes. Then we'll have Professor Lovemore Maduku to give an overall presentation of his findings and recommendations. So to go in first is Dr. Natalie Labrent. Hey, my sister. I can't even pronounce the other last name. So she led our research for South Africa. She is currently the researcher at the Parliament of South Africa. So Dr. Natalie, the floor is yours. You have your 9 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much, Program Director, and good morning, honorable members of Parliament and distinguished participants. My name is Natalie Labrant-Loxton, and yes, I'm a researcher at the South African Parliament, and I'm also a research associate at the University of Johannesburg. I will just share my screen with you quickly. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see your screen.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you for this opportunity thank you. And thank you for this opportunity to present on the experiences of the South African Parliament under COVID-19. Overall, South Africa's response to the pandemic, and of course I'm talking about the Parliament specifically, has largely been informed by 3 core factors. Firstly, the Parliament's constitutional role and powers. Secondly, by the Disaster Management Act, which currently regulates South Africa's response to the pandemic. And thirdly, the autonomy that Parliament enjoys over its internal rules and processes. And this is also captured in the Constitution. Now, just to give you a brief overview of the roles and powers of the Parliament, South Africa's Parliament is a bicameral parliament. It comprises the National Assembly and the National Council of Provinces. Now, these 2 houses have similar powers, but also distinctive ones. For instance, it is only the National Assembly that is mandated to choose the president, while the National Council of Provinces specifically needs to ensure that provincial interests are considered at the national level when it comes to lawmaking. However, in terms of their general powers, they both are involved in the lawmaking process. They both need to ensure that they provide a national platform for issues to be publicly debated. They both need to ensure that the public participates in the lawmaking process. They need to ensure that the public has access to their meetings and their documents. And also, they both have the authority to make their own rules and orders and to determine their own internal proceedings. Now, with the onset of COVID-19, South Africa's response was to declare a state of national disaster in March 2020. And this has been regulated by the Disaster Management Act, which is still in operation. Essentially, it allows a member of the executive, currently the Minister of Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs, to oversee the operation of this act. This minister is allowed to announce regulations in terms of this act. And according to this act, we have different levels of lockdown depending on the perceived risk to the country. So when the state of national disaster was first announced in March, South Africa was in lockdown level 5. We are currently still under lockdown, although in lockdown level 1. So with this initial announcement of state of national disaster, Parliament suspended its program as a precautionary measure under lockdown level 5. Of course, Parliament could not do this forever for two key reasons. Firstly, its constitutional powers remained in place. The Disaster Management Act does not, neither the Constitution allows for Parliament's constitutional powers to be suspended or amended in any way. And secondly, the lockdown regulations actually classified members of Parliament as an essential service provider. So for these two key reasons, Parliament was actually obligated to adapt to the COVID-19 situation. So the interventions that Parliament undertook can be grouped as follows. There were political interventions, this mainly entailing adopting the necessary rules and processes for virtual or hybrid meetings. And then, of course, the administrative interventions, those or developing those policies and implementing them to ensure minimized risk and exposure for all people involved in the business of Parliament. I'd like to just zoom in briefly on the political interventions. As I mentioned, these have been underpinned by the Houses adopting the necessary rules and processes for virtual meetings. And it's these rules and processes that actually allowed for Parliament to start with its virtual committee oversight meetings after they were adopted. And this actually started with the Minister of Health briefing the Portfolio Committee on Health on South Africa's response right at the beginning, and eventually it moved to involve more departments briefing more committees that on the country's response. And of course, this expanded later to also then include hybrid committee oversight. Parliament also was involved in adopting a special budget specifically related to COVID-19. This budget is called the Supplementary Budget that was tabled in addition to the usual annual budget and medium-term budget. Parliamentary committees on finance vigorously interrogated this budget. They ensured that there were hybrid public hearings on it. The public was able to comment and input into it before it was adopted. And also after its adoption, the Parliamentary Committees on Finance have received regular briefings on the budget's implementation, specifically related to allegations of COVID-19 corruption that has surfaced. Parliament also was able to hold virtual plenary sessions. At first, of course, this has also then expanded to include hybrid plenary sittings as the level of risk was reduced. Public engagements has also continued, first virtually, but now that's also done hybridly. Some of them are physical. And here, of course, I'm referring to public hearings. I'm referring to the annual Women's Parliament, the annual Youth Parliament that have all taken place hybridly. Then the constituency work, because of the lockdown, constituency work was delayed by a month, but from June to 2020 to July 2020, but this did take place as well, of course, under safe government regulations. And then, of course, Parliament also continued its work in terms of parliamentary diplomacy, where it participated in meetings of the multilateral parliamentary organizations that it is a member of. And these, of course, include the SADC Parliamentary Forum, the Pan-African Parliaments, the Interparliamentary Union, and others. And the idea essentially was to engage with other parliaments, learn from their experiences, share knowledge on how best to operate under the circumstances of the pandemic. And none of this could have taken place without the necessary technology. Of course, Parliament has a TV channel on DSTV 408, where all its meetings are broadcasted, and Parliament also makes use of social media platforms like Twitter and YouTube to live stream its meetings. These, of course, have been in place even before the COVID-19 pandemic. This picture here, I would just like to share with you to show you what the very first hybrid plenary session looked like. One can clearly see members of Parliament observing social distancing and some members connecting to the National Assembly virtually. And yeah, it definitely looks very different to what it did in pre-COVID times when this chamber used to be full. Here are some pictures of how Parliament adapted. Here you can see that by the 15th of May 2020, this was 2 months after the lockdown was announced, Parliament had held its 100th virtual meeting. And actually, by the end of December, more than 1,200 committee meetings have been held at Parliament, this by National Assembly and National Council of Provinces committees jointly. At the bottom here, this is the Youth Parliament that was held in a hybrid fashion. This was held at the parliamentary precinct. You can clearly see students are observing social distancing. They are wearing protective masks, and technologies were also used to ensure that it can take place in a hybrid fashion. At the top here, this is a current public hearing that is taking place. It is off-site in a different province from the Western Cape where Parliament is located. Members of the public are participating, and they are observing social distancing measures and are participating safely. Of course, and then very significantly, members of cabinet, including the head of state, has been throughout the lockdown period been expected to answer questions in both houses, the National Assembly and the National Council of Provinces. And here is an example of the head of state doing just that in the NCOP, and this was, of course, live streamed on a news channel called the NCA. So to conclude, various recommendations, I think, emerged when considering South Africa's experience under COVID-19. The first is really the importance of Parliament having legal autonomy over their internal rules and procedures to adopt swiftly to crisis situations. And of course, this cannot be done without Parliament actually exercising that autonomy and power to do it. So they have to adopt special rules to function under extraordinary circumstances, as was done in the South African case. Utilizing technologies has been absolutely crucial in the sense that it has promoted transparency of the government's crisis interventions, because the public was able to see the questions that members of Parliament were asking cabinet members and departments. It has led to expanded public access. These meetings were all live streamed on various public platforms, allowing for that access. And of course, technologies also assisted in ensuring that public engagement and constituency work continue through hybrid interventions in a safe manner. Very importantly as well was the swift adoption of the crisis budget without compromising scrutiny. As I mentioned, this entailed the finance committees robustly engaging with that budget before it was adopted. It involved many stakeholders They were all able to comment and give inputs into it. And of course, it did not just stop there. Finance committees continue to receive regular briefings on investigations on COVID-19 related corruption that has surfaced. Parliament also continued with its international engagement to learn from other parliaments and share knowledge and experiences. The idea obviously being to really come up with best practices and ways to be better prepared in future if similar crises should arise. And then finally, very importantly, developing and implementing safety protocols to ensure the safety of all stakeholders involved in the business of Parliament. This has played out where Parliament has, for instance, needed to reconfigure its committee rooms to ensure that people can participate safely there when they attend this physically. Staff have been working remotely. So those are just a few of the examples that I can mention, but very importantly to ensure that the business of Parliament continues in a safe manner. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Natalie. Very comprehensive recommendations, and it was also interesting, like to learn the political interventions that were instituted in South Africa. So what we are going to do, we are also going to listen to other case studies and the presentation from Professor Maduku. Then we have a plenary session. So all the questions, you can note them down, and during the plenary session, you can then ask your questions. So the next case study will be from Mozambique, Dr. Egidio Guhambe, who is a democracy and governance expert in Mozambique, is going to do that presentation. After Dr. Egidio, there is Dr. Melvis Ndilose, who is going to share with us the case study from Cameroon. Then Mr. Gibairo Jane, who is the communications director at the Gambia National Assembly, who is going to share with us the case study for the Gambia. Then after Mr. Jane is Dr. Bel Hassan Enori, a democracy and governance expert from Tunisia. He's going to share with us the case study for Tunisia. Then Mr. Moses Ano Awo, a legal practitioner and a democracy and governance expert from Kenya, is going to share with us the case study for that country. I haven't seen Dr. Avori from Nigeria, but if he is not here, Professor Maduku will do his case study. So in that order, over to you, Dr. Egidio Guhambe. You're on mute.
Okay, thank you. I think now it's okay.
Yeah, we can hear you loud and clear.
Okay, thank you very much for this opportunity. I will quickly share the case study of Mozambique during this pandemic period. Okay, Mozambique registered his first COVID case in 22 March 2020. And then the President of the Republic declared the state of emergency on 3rd March. It was just after the questionable election process where even President and Parliament was still installed themselves on the situation. And then the period caused an enormous problem on how the situation will work. The spirit of COVID had directly impacted on the function and composition agenda of Parliament. At the first, the question of knowledge of technology and the context, how to deal with this, it was really a big challenge for the Parliament in Mozambique in this period. This is just a photo how the Parliament has been organized normally. And then everything has been changed during the period. At first, I mean, even if the constitutional has some instrument for continued work during the state of emergency, the parliament has a lot of problem on how to mobilize the instrument to work during the context of restriction. What they did at first, they transfer all competence of how to work for the parliament for the permanent committee. This committee assumed a lot of activity, and then the section tried to be in virtual mode, even if they're challenging with the difficulty of technology. A lot of MPs, they don't have knowledge on this new way of work. And then even the parliament was not organized on this case. They try even to work from the hotel, but the cost of how to work in the hotel and then payment of the hotel was very difficult for them. And then they reduce a lot of their activity, namely the oversight function has been most affected during this period. I mean, the readaptation of the parliament work in the model of restriction was not always shows in detail. I mean, having a plan or having a kind of a guideline of how to work during the pandemic period. Some activity has been added during the context and then the gravity of the crisis. I mean, the nature of emergency has directly affected in the man of the role of the parliament and how they can deal with their role. And then during the period where they are just getting in the parliament. I mean, the national legal framework for the crisis is we can say it's a very limited, even if the constitution have a little bit open situation to interpret it. It was a very difficult for them to quickly make it very useful for them and then continue it without a lot of problem. Just to make you just some example, I mean, they even approved some instrument to deal with the public calamity during the period. And then, for example, the period of extension of a state of emergency was not even previous. I mean, it was not I can say it was not in the provision of the constitution or other instrumental for how the parliament can work. The main juridical regime for managing risk and disaster was being approved for this law. It was after 2-3 months after the start of the state of emergency. We can say in general, like Mozambique constitution does not completely define the juridical framework on how the parliament should work in time of crisis. And this is why a new law had been approved. However, the law brought incongruence to some parliamentary function. The oversight function has been more affected by the context. I mean, they try to get the quick response for the contest. For example, they tried, as I mentioned before, the approval of the law. And then even this approval of the law has a lot of difficulty. It was namely the executive power who proposed this law, because the parliament was new in their function. As I mentioned, it was 2 months after there has been named officially as a MP. A lot of them they were new on the function. The Mozambican parliament exceptionally approved the instrument which the executive has proposed. I mean, they have never monitoring this situation. I mean, this new framework of how they can deal in the context of the crisis. But as we interview a lot of them, they say, even if we don't have a lot of experience, we try to deal with what it was possible at that moment. I mean, the overall impact we can say in the legislative function, the function was very limited, and despite some amendment they approved, the problem was continued. And the legislative function just work in the very, very basic functions. In the oversight, they work with a lot of restriction. Most of the oversight tasks previously excluded has been, has been let out. And then, for example, they mentioned that they planned 21 work of visit of a different executive or minister. And then they cut a lot of their agenda, and they work just a little and limited on what it was related with the COVID context. So, for example, monitoring the public health, monitoring how the government or the executive is dealing with the COVID, not their function as normal. In the representative function, this was a very restrictive. A lot of civil society organizations which work with the parliament, they told us that they get a lot of uncertainty of how to work with the parliament, because the parliament was a little bit not very well organized to challenge with the COVID context. In general, we can say in the context of a serious limitation of parliamentary function, and then the budget was cutted, and then no exceptional budget for this period. And then the parliament was working just in the essential activity. As conclusion, we can say the COVID pandemic has drastically altered the routine of the parliament in Mozambique, and then affected seriously how the parliament can work. The Mozambican parliament was not able to quickly provide a strategic response to ensure in main legislative oversight and representative activity. The parliament focused on producing a framework instrument to cope with the spread of the coronavirus, not with their normal activity. With limited activity, the parliament was unable to maintain its agenda, already affected by the financial cut caused by the COVID, because when the COVID started, a lot of budget was cut to make it directly to the COVID situation, not for the normal function. With this difficulty, the produce of a strategy instrument or plan for COVID context, the parliament was naturally inoperated, and then most of the time was in the book of the executive power. As a recommendation, we can say to the improve of methodology with necessary meaning for virtual section. For example, the main problem of dealing with the context is a virtual process. It was completely impossible to work remotely for a lot of MPs. And then maybe develop the strategic instrument or plan that is systematically can give the orientation about how Parliament can deal with or conduct activity in the context of conflict. And maybe we are thinking on how to get something like a guideline for the conflict, for the crisis, and then maybe to give you another Mozambican situation. So Mozambique is now fighting with the other conflict, which is a military conflict related with the insurgents in the north of Mozambique, and then they don't have even the instrument for work with this kind of crisis. The Parliament should eventually create a commission to specify monitoring moment of the crisis in order to guarantee the social assistance and communication with the population which is affected. Maybe it could be good for them. And then keep and modernize the Parliament room with furniture and the technology. Furniture, for now, it's completely impossible to work virtually or remotely from the Parliament because they don't have a lot of material for this kind of work. Maybe develop a digital instrument for monitoring government activity during the period, because a lot of their activity during this period was strictly affected and limited on how to work during the period. From here, I can say thank you.
Muito obrigado, Dr. Guhambe. Thank you very much for your presentation. And I think we can now, we can even see, the varied levels of response when you compare with the first presentation from South Africa. You highlighted several weaknesses, including a clear legal framework and how parliamentary roles such as oversight, representation, and legislating have been affected during this period. So thank you very much for your presentation, and thank you for the recommendations that you put across. Allow me now to move to Cameroon. Dr. Melvis Ndilose, my sister from Cameroon. She is our technical expert from International IDEA, who is currently seconded to the African Union Political Affairs, Peace and Security Department. So she's joining us from US. I think it's around 4 a.m. or very early in the morning. Hello, Melvis, are you here?
I can hear you, yes.
Yes, you can go ahead with your presentation.
All right, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for the opportunity to be part of this round, this discussions, very important around the role of the parliament, and just for the opportunity to share the Cameroonian experience. I had requested permission to, in the circumstance, to just do my presentation without, I don't have a PowerPoint presentation to share, and I would, in the circumstance, have my video off with your permission. So I would like to begin on Cameroon's experience by highlighting the scope of the pandemic, Cameroon's experience with the pandemic, before narrowing down to the role of the parliament, building on its mandate and the different actions and measures that the parliament took to address the situation. As of, between January 3rd and November 1st, January 3rd, 2020 and November 1st, 2021, a total of a little over 104,000 cases were recorded in Cameroon, and a little over 1,700 deaths. This, at some point, was the highest in the Central African region, and the current situation that is we currently have a weekly infection rate of about 200 persons per week. Like many other countries, Cameroon was unprepared for this pandemic, and it exposed or either revealed or amplified several governance deficiencies, and it was a real test to its democratic institutions, their effectiveness, especially and including the parliament. So the government of Cameroon, once COVID hit, reacted like many other countries, assuming full gamut of the executive, closing borders and businesses and schools, and mass restricting and limiting interurban transportation, instituted a curfew, deployed security forces to enforce prohibitions, obliged mask wearing and imposed social distancing requirements. In the middle of this, the parliament was faced with the big question what the legal basis of its own contribution in addressing this situation. The first thing I'd like to highlight is regarding the Cameroonian Parliament. It's like the South African Parliament. It's also a bicameral system. It constitutes of the Senate and the National Assembly. And combinedly, both houses have a membership of 280, but it's the ruling party has a majority, wields the majority of the seat. The Constitution of Cameroon is completely silent on the role of the parliament in situations of emergency. So this is the exclusive prerogative of the executive. And the Cameroon government used that to the fullest during the pandemic. Article 9 of the Cameroonian 1996 Constitution broadly deals with the issue of emergency powers, granting the president very sweeping authorities to assume as he seems fit during an emergency situation, or mainly to preserve national integrity. It's so sweeping such that the president needs to just make the decision, and he is only required to inform the nation of his decision by a message. And that's exactly what happened. So the parliament has no specifically defined role, and also no oversight role on the executive. So this is something that I really wanted to highlight. So without a legal mandate and a clear role, how was the parliament able to maintain its functionality during COVID-19? And how was it, to what extent was the parliament able to exercise accountability and other oversight action of the government? So assessment of the parliament's functions builds on 4 baseline functions outlined by Murphy in his 2020 publications, and these include decision making, especially with regard to the crisis, demonstrating leadership in their performance of constitutional functions, role modeling for the rest of the nation, and as well as protecting themselves collectively and individually as representatives of their constituencies. So we've already stated that they have no constitutionally prescribed role. It's silent on that. But with regards to role modeling and other aspects, the parliament adhered to the government's social distancing measures, and during its ordinary and extraordinary sessions that were held. So it continued its meeting and held its regular ordinary and extraordinary meetings without interruption. They only relocated to a bigger conference center to be able to enable that to happen. And this, for instance, is contrary to the steps that was taken in other Central African countries such as Gabon, where parliamentary committees sat in limited numbers, and their proceedings were also limited to issues that were considered to be of absolute necessity. In other countries as well, the parliamentary activities grinded to a halt, but at least in Cameroon, the parliament maintained remained operational, holding sessions, and it prioritized COVID concerns on its agenda. So all the requirements of mask wearing and all of that were respected. But some members, there was some criticism as far as this is concerned, and I could highlight that later. The parliament also approved budget, a special budget for the COVID impact. The budget was meant to deal with the socioeconomic consequences of COVID-19. And so those were the two main things that the government, the parliament was able to do during this time. There were also, again, issues of corruption that was raised around the management of the fund that that was approved by the parliament, and this is currently being investigated by a special bench that was created at the Supreme Court in Cameroon. So generally, that's how those are the two things that are worth highlighting with regards to Cameroon, the parliament, in the parliament's function. What recommendations can be made? The first is very obvious. There's need to strengthen parliamentary oversight functions over the executive, especially during periods of national emergencies. That's pretty clear. The challenge is that the ruling party currently wields the majority, and so arriving at such a decision to mitigate or to impose a certain degree of oversight, as with the South African experience, might be challenging. But in the very least, the parliament could pass a special parliamentary resolution requiring government ministers and ministers to brief the parliament of government actions taken within their local jurisdictions. Secondly, it's important for there is a lack of clarity in the whole in Cameroon's law on the regulation of emergencies. So I did mention that Article 9 gives powers to the president, but it's not very clear about, unlike other situations of emergency such as armed conflict, violent extremism, civil unrest, and natural disasters. The law is not very clear, does not clearly provide for situations of health emergencies. And so this is something that the parliament can look into during this time, can build on the momentum to recommend a review or the expansion of the scope of emergency situations to include health emergencies. And this could be done through an ordinary law. Lastly, there's need to sort of improve improve or give more visibility to the Constitutional Council. It was also silent, and there's need for it to assume a more forthright role in managing the crisis, especially in a context where the executive is as powerful as has already been explained. So those are just a few things I could quickly highlight regarding the Cameroonian experience. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ndilose. I think the issue around weak legislative framework, building from Mozambique, Cameroon, and I'm sure Professor Maduku will touch on the implications and what has been some observations, across the continent, in terms of the implications of weak oversight functions of parliament across the continent. So thank you once again. Mr. Jibairo Jane from the Gambia.
Thank you very much, Graham, and good morning to everyone in the meeting. I am trying to share my screen, just a moment. Okay, just to. Okay. Good morning, everyone. What I will quickly be doing is to first give you a rundown of how these slides will look like. We're going to look at an introduction of the which will concern the nature of the legislature in the Gambia, and we will look at the methodology that we adopted. Then we have a quick synopsis of the COVID situation in the country before getting into the details, which is the legal framework and the effectiveness of the National Assembly during this COVID crisis. So first and foremost, I'm sure most of you, or quite all of you, are aware that Gambia is the smallest country in mainland Africa. We are just about 10,000 square kilometers, and with a population, according to the Gambia Bureau of Statistics, we have a population of 1.8 million people. We also have a presidential system of government. Of course, within the principles of separation of powers, because you have the executive branch, you have the legislature, and you have the also has the unicameral legislature. Overall, the National Assembly of the Gambia has 58 members. 53 of these members are elected from being Speaker of the National Assembly are being.
Mr. Gibair is breaking badly. Graham.
Can I be heard now?
Yes, we can hear you now, but you're breaking up.
Yes.
Kindly proceed.
Okay. Please alert me when I am breaking. So
you are on the fourth slide.
Yeah. Thank you. What I was saying is that the National Assembly of the Gambia is a unicameral legislature. There is only a single chamber that is composed of 58 members. And out of these 58 members, 53 are elected through a single member constituency every 5 years. And 5 other members are nominated by the president as per the dictates of the 1997 Constitution of the Gambia. And it is from these 5 nominated by the president that the Speaker of the National Assembly and the Deputy Speaker of the National Assembly are elected from. So in looking at this assignment, we decided to look at what literature did say about effectiveness of parliament in times of crisis, not only in the Gambia, but around the world. We also had some key informant interviews within the National Assembly. And because I am within the precincts of the National Assembly, gave us the opportunity to have participant observations. So overall, when it comes to COVID-19, the Gambia recorded its first case of COVID-19 in March 2020. And this was at a time that the National Assembly of the Gambia was on the first ordinary session for the 2020 legislative year. As at now, as at 30th October 2021, Gambia has confirmed COVID cases of 9,973. And out of this, 14 active cases are currently being treated at the COVID treatment centers. We have 9,618 recoveries, and we have 341 deaths, COVID-related deaths. And this information is from the Ministry of Health as at 31st October 2021. When we look at the legal framework, we've noticed that the National Assembly of the Gambia has very limited legal foundation to function during crisis. The reason being that if we looked at the Constitution of the Gambia, we noticed all provisions related to the National Assembly, its establishment, functions, and powers are in Section 100 of the Constitution. This Section 100 establishes Parliament as the legislative branch of the government of the Gambia. Sections 101 and 102 grant the National Assembly oversight in the sense that the section explicitly states that the National Assembly shall conduct oversight on the functions and conduct of the executive by establishing committees to that effect. And when we come to in cases of crisis or more broadly emergencies, explicit provision in the Constitution of the Gambia is Section 34, subsection 6. And this is not directly related to the National Assembly. What Section 34, subsection 6 of the Constitution did do is to grant power to the President of the Republic to declare a state of emergency during crisis. So you notice that this is a section that is not directly empowering the Parliament, but on the other hand, it is empowering the President to declare a state of emergency. However, the section broke down this declaration into two. One is that when the Parliament is in session, the President can only declare a state of emergency for 7 days. And at the expiry of that 7 days, Parliament must extend or revoke the state of emergency. If Parliament is not in session, the President can declare a state of emergency for 21 days. And at the expiry of that 21 days, Parliament must be convened to either extend the state of emergency or not to extend the state of emergency. So what we did see in Gambia during the COVID crisis was that when the index case was announced, Parliament, the President declared a state of emergency for 7 days, and Parliament extended the emergency for 45 months, effectively locked down the country, restricted civil liberties, and banned public gatherings. But this also happened at a time that there were political fallout in the country because we were gearing towards elections, and the current president is leading a coalition government of 9 other political parties. So affected the legislature, and to the extent that regardless of the COVID situation, after the expiry of the first state of emergency, Parliament refused to approve any more state of emergency for the president. So the president throughout the period was relying on the executive, executive orders to ban public gatherings and impose COVID restriction measures. The Gambia. First, what we did is
you're breaking off
the legislative capacity of the Parliament.
Mr. Johnny, can you hear me? You're breaking off. Hello? Hello? Mm.
I propose that we move to the next while we try to reconnect with him so that we don't lose time.
Yeah, I think he is even dropped off. Oh, okay. I will let him know that maybe he can come later.
Graham, am I still breaking? I am back again.
Yeah, maybe you can walk us through without a video.
Huh? Can I be heard now?
Yeah, we can hear you without a video, I think.
Okay.
It seems your connection is weak. So.
Yes, but I have just switched connection, so I don't know if I am heard.
Yeah, I can hear you now, and I'm sure everyone is hearing you. Kindly
Everyone
proceed.
can hear me. Okay. So as I was saying, when we look at the overall impact of COVID-19, we notice that it has significantly affected the legislative capacity of the parliament. Because when COVID started in the Gambia, parliament was in session and parliament has to break.
Mm. Mr. Jani, let me allow the next presenter. You can come in later then. Dr. Belhassan Enori, are you here?
Yes, I am here. Good morning.
Yeah, good morning. I don't know what time it is in Tunis right now, but
It's
great to have
11.
you here. Yeah, so you can proceed and present the Tunisia case study.
Thank you very much for this invitation. What I am going to talk about is maybe something of history, because since 25 of July, the President of the Republic decided to dissolve and freeze the parliament. So our case study focused on the period of 2020 and the first half of 2021. During that period, there was a huge sanitary crisis in Tunisia. We reached a point of an average of 100 persons dead per day for COVID. So the crisis of the health crisis was accompanied by multiple economic, social, and structural problems, and even institutional problems. There was a lot of debate, a lot of discussion. And a lot of tensions in this. Do you hear me? Hello? Do you hear me?
You were breaking off, but now we can hear you. Can kindly proceed.
Yes. So we had a lot of problems between institutions and a lot of protests and sit-in and a general feeling of people that the institution of the parliament is not fulfilling its role facing the pandemic. The legal framework in Tunisia, mainly the constitution, gives the parliament the possibility to delegate some of its prerogatives in some circumstances. And this delegation came to make to give the parliament the possibility for the government to act better and in an efficient way and in an instant way facing the crisis. And indeed, the parliament in the first half of 2020 gave delegation to the government. And this delegation was limited in time and limited in the subject. So this delegation was given for a month for the president of the government in order to make decree law facing the pandemic. And the president of the government made a lot of decree law, and there was a general feeling of the Tunisian society and the political parties that the decisions and the choices of the president of the government at that time in the first half of 2020 was efficient and made a positive impact. And during those days, the pandemic was in its lower degree. Besides of that, the parliament made some legislations in order to counter COVID and its effects. And the parliament made many laws in order to seek fundings to counter the effects of the pandemic and to so the parliament made some legislations in order to make like fundraising to counter the COVID, and made laws to enter into the COVAX agreement, etc. So the parliament also created a cell of crisis in order to ensure and guarantee the continuity of the parliamentary work. And this crisis cell was created in order to follow the evolution of the pandemic and to hear the government and its representatives and experts on matters related to COVID. And also this parliamentary cell crisis made some recommendations, and those recommendations were adopted by the parliament. Unfortunately, the recommendations and their adoption in the parliament was altering and was in contradiction with many laws. So this cell of crisis initiative was not favoring the rule of law, because it was created without a text that gives the possibility to create it, and its decisions were adopted not in format of laws, but in format of decisions of the parliament. And the decisions of the parliament have no place in the pyramid of laws in Tunisia. So the parliament continued to make some plenary sessions by internet, by distant plenary sessions, and this helped the parliament to move and to review some laws and make debates, and even the commissions of the parliament continued to work in person and by virtual tools. The Health Commission continued its work, and it had to work more intensively because of the importance of its role in overseeing the acts of the government and maybe proposing something to the government or receiving information from the government in order to shape new laws. During that period, there was talks about the enactment of a sanitary crisis law, which may give the government and the parliament more prerogatives in order to be a little bit more flexible when combating the crisis. But in general, the experience of our parliament during 2020 and 2021 until 25 of July was in general a great failure. And this failure and this mismanagement of the pandemic resulted of an ability of the government to move and to make measures because of the bureaucratic hurdles that face the administration and the laws that need to be abided while the government and the executive branch and the administration is working. The parliament didn't give enough flexibility for the government to act. So the government was unable to take any substantive response. And due to this mismanagement, we arrived to a peak of deaths of 100% per day for a lot of time. The mismanagement of the pandemic with other deep failures of the legislative branch gave sufficient ground for the executive power vested in the President of the Republic to conduct a highly debated move, that's to freeze, suspend, and overtake legislative role for an undefined period. So we are still waiting, Mr. the President, to declare the end of freezing the government. People talk about new election for the legislative branch. People talk about a new constitution. There's a big debate about the move of the president to freeze and suspend the parliament. Some say it is a coup d'etat, some say it is a correct interpretation of the constitution. So unfortunately, our recommendations now are no longer able to be applied, since that the parliament is no more existing. But we recommended when we wrote our paper that there is a need for a better parliamentarian environment. Members of parliament need to be fully understand their role in the parliament and their role in a democracy, and they need to tend to be more diplomatic and non-violent and not using hate speech, because during 2020 and 2021 the parliament witnessed a lot of physical violence, not only verbal violence but even physical violence. The work of the commissions need to be more methodological and more scientific. The commission need to classify the ideas and to know how to exploit the ideas and to use the social science methods in order to take the information and try to transform the raw material of the information into a good bill of law that can make a difference. We also recommended that there is a need to establish the constitutional court, because today we don't have a constitutional court, and this gave the President of the Republic to impose whatever interpretation he decides of the Constitution. So he interpreted the Constitution in a way to freeze the parliament, and we do not have still an established constitutional court, although the constitution say that Tunisia needs to establish a constitutional court. So we need a constitutional court to verify the acts of the President of the Republic in times of crisis. We would like that the President do not convert himself into a despot in the name of crisis. We also think that it is good to amend the internal rules of the parliament to permit a fast-track way to enact ordinary laws, because it is today very heavy to enact laws. There is a lot of time span, that periods and deadlines that need to be respected, and there's a lot of bureaucracy inside the parliament. So we would like that the parliament creates for itself a possibility for a fast way, a faster track to make laws. So we also suggested that the crisis cell needs to be dissolved, and the parliament needs to get enough courage to give delegation of its powers to the executive according to some conditions and some standards. So, and also I concluded that the parliaments need to create a platform, an electronic platform, in order to make it secure, safe, and people can, citizens can also participate in this application, in this program, in those electronic debates, because we witnessed that the online debates are not all published, are not all broadcasted by TV, and this reduces the visibility of what is happening inside the parliament. So I conclude that maybe if the parliament didn't mismanage the crisis, maybe the president cannot have the pretext or the justification to make what he made. But according to what the president and his supporters say, that the mismanagement in particular was the cause for the suspension of the parliament, the mismanagement of the pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Belhassan.
Thank you.
You shared some very interesting perspectives. I think it builds on the challenges around the legal framework, which has been also shared by previous presenters. Very interesting recommendations as well. So shall we move to Kenya now? Mr. Moses Owori. Moses, can you try to stick to 9 minutes, please? We are running out of time.
Thank you, Graham. I'm trying to share the screen. I don't know. I'm having challenges sharing the screen, but I can send you my PowerPoint. Just get.
Do you have pictorials or graphs that you wanted to present? You can proceed.
It's just a PowerPoint. It's just a PowerPoint presentation.
No, yeah, you can proceed.
Okay, let me proceed. The way I've organized the presentation is basically to outline what is expected in the study, which I will not repeat given the time constraints. Then I will give a very short overview of the parliamentary mandate, then the documents I considered in this case study, and the respondents interviewed, the main findings and observations, and the recommendations thereafter. I think the presentations are very interesting, and it shows the different approaches and the different stages at which our parliaments are, and of course, the difference in terms of guarantees and constitutional guarantees that our parliaments have. I want to say that Kenya, in that spectrum, falls within what you would call, what some of the presenters have called that we have quite substantial constitutional guarantees in terms of parliamentary autonomy, how parliament regulates its own business, how parliament regulates its own calendar, establishes its committees, and oversights the executive. So what was considered, I give that as a background in terms of my presentation, especially and the response to the COVID pandemic. So this case study assesses the emergency powers adopted by Kenya and reviews the legislative framework and assesses the parliamentary oversight interventions during the pandemic. If you look at the Kenyan, why I say that we fall towards the spectrum of quite substantial autonomy of the Kenyan parliament, I think COVID happened at a time when the Kenyan parliament has undergone quite a long period of reform that began around the 2000s with the enactment of the Parliamentary Services Act of 2000 that re-established the Parliamentary Service Commission and gave it quite substantial authority in terms of autonomy. The enactment of the 2010 Constitution also enhanced the parliamentary autonomy, and Kenyan Parliament consists of the National Assembly and the Senate in a bicameral setting, and we also have 47 county assemblies, which are the representative bodies of the 47 devolved units. Parliament is the primary organ of government for legislation, oversight of the executive, and representation. Public participation is at the center of Kenyan parliamentary practice and is considered primary under Article 10 of the Kenyan Constitution. So in undertaking this study, I considered the report of the Senate established an ad hoc committee to comprehensively look at the response to the COVID-19 situation in 2020, shortly after the identification of the first cases in the second week of March of 2020. The idea behind the ad hoc committee was to take a comprehensive approach in terms of policy and legislation in response to the COVID situation. This happened because the Ministry of Health and other line ministries had taken initial interventions to issue guidelines and to issue directives and to gazette legal notices through their respective legislative powers. So Parliament, in terms of Parliament, needed to take a comprehensive view in terms of what was required in terms of policy and what was required in terms of legislation. What happened after that, unfortunately, or owing to the emergency requirements, was really not to implement a comprehensive approach, but to have sort of a piecemeal reaction in line with what the different ministries had taken. The first interventions were issued by the Ministry of Health, but the Ministry of Education, Ministry of Interior, Ministry of Immigration, Ministry of Transport followed up with issuing their own respective legal notices under their own legislations. Most of these were restrictive and were taking into account the different mandates under their jurisdiction to issue restrictive interventions in terms of emergencies. So these case study, as I said, looked at the reports of this ad hoc committee of the Senate. There was a draft bill that was submitted by that ad hoc committee as a companion to that ad hoc committee report in response to COVID. There's been a report that has now been published after the report, but there was an initial draft report before the case study was done. But now the report has now been sent to Parliament on misappropriation of funds, which is an oversight function of Parliament. I've also looked at the Pandemic Response and Management Bill, which is a Senate Bill of number 6 of 2020. There are World Bank updates. There is a Constitution of Kenya, there's a Parliamentary Service Act of 2012, the Parliamentary Service, the Public Financial Management Act, which gives the Parliament budgetary oversight authority to oversight the Ministry of Finance in undertaking, doing the supplementary budgets and revising the finance bills, the tax breaks and the changes to the VAT that were enacted in 2020. There's the Public Health Act, which gives the Ministry of Health certain powers in an emergency situation for public health purposes. Then we had the Tax Law Amendment Act of 2020, which introduced certain tax provisions in the VAT Act and the Public Finance Bill of 2020 to respond to COVID. Then in terms of the conduct of proceedings in Parliament and Parliament committees, the joint committees of the Senate and the National Assembly established a special committee that came up with the Joint Speakers Guidelines consequent to the declaration of COVID-19, which regulated the use of technology, regulated the use of the proceedings in plenary, proceedings in committee, and conferences, public participation during the COVID pandemic. And the speakers issued the joint guidelines to govern or regulate parliamentary business. I also conducted 4 main interviews, which I spoke to Senator Sakaja on the Joint Senate Ad Hoc Committee on the report, Honorable Sabina Chege, the National Assembly Health Committee Chairperson, Honorable Tinda Molo, the Chairperson of National Justice and Legal Affairs Committee, and an Assistant Director in the Office of the Clerk. The main findings and observations are that the immediate government responses related to primarily focused on health, social, public order, and movement restrictions. These were the immediate responses, and the social included, gatherings, closure of schools. These were all undertaken between March and May of 2020. And most of these were taken by ministries issuing guidelines, legal notices, and sort of the delegated legislation instruments under legislation which are already govern their respective mandates. The government issued dusk to dawn curfews, restriction of inter-county movement, and we also closed borders and the airport. There was a closure of schools, restrictions of social gatherings. The executive took subsequent actions to support livelihoods. This included tax breaks. This included some interventions relating to movement of mobile money, especially to small, micro, and medium enterprises, and lifting some taxes. There was the government also initiated discussions in terms of international budgetary support and aligning the Kenyan debt situation in response to or obtaining certain debt breaks from the international community in relation to fund the COVID situation. As I said before, Parliament began from a footing which was in favor of a comprehensive approach to policy and legislative to give policy and legislative guidance to the executive through the report of the ad hoc committee of the executive. But how it played out was that the bill that came out of this report was not enacted in its entirety, but certain parts of it were taken to amend specific legislation. For instance, the Finance Act of 2020, the VAT Act, the Tax Laws Amendment Act of 2020, instead of amending sort of one comprehensive legislation or policy. So that was it became more of a reaction to a piecemeal reaction to the specific requirements as had been initiated by the executive. The parliament, in my assessment, the Parliament of Kenya is generally well placed to discharge its mandate given the constitutional and administrative autonomy. This I've given the background of the constitution, and even before that, the amendments which gave the Parliamentary Service Commission sort of very enhanced powers in the separation of powers framework to govern its own calendar, to govern its own fund, to approve its own budget, and sort of very enhanced oversight powers on the executive. Parliament provided oversight in investigations around misappropriation of funds. What happened, especially in response to the public health emergency, there was quite a lot of procurement by the Kenya Medical Supplies Agency, what we call KEMSA in Kenya, to nationally procure the health requirements by the Ministry of Health. And this created a lot of, there are a lot of questions which arose in terms of applying funds which were set aside for the COVID-19 situation. And this has attracted an extended investigation by Parliament, the Committee on Health. Actually, they've had also, the Senate Committee on Health has also had joint investigation with the ad hoc committee established by the Senate to specifically look at the procurement processes, abuses of the public procurement law, abuses of the Public Finance Act, and the report has now been sent to Parliament for adoption. It was adopted in September, and
Sorry,
has also.
Can you wrap up in 2 minutes?
Okay,
yeah.
I am wrapping up. There's restrictions in terms of the parliamentary business. I've spoken about the guidelines. The guidelines are considered in the report, and so I will not restate them. The main recommendation is that the Parliament needs to undertake a full assessment of the responses and to see if the comprehensive approach would have been better, and if the extended implications of the COVID situation requires a more comprehensive strategy. This may include to relook at the executive powers, especially on procurement and issuance of the executive directives and legal notices. Parliament needs to look at the safety nets provided in terms of securing lives and securing livelihoods and protecting business. The budgetary support, especially the debt financing options which have been considered by the Parliament, needs to be scrutinized in terms of oversight, including the stimulus packages which the government issued. The extent of the implications of COVID to school closures, I think, needs to be relooked at, especially as we go ahead. And then the implementation of the joint speakers guidelines in terms of an enhanced use of technology and parliamentary business, and to the extent that they affect the public participation in parliamentary business, needs to be looked at and appropriate measures taken. So that is the end of it. Graham, I'll send you my PowerPoint. Unfortunately, I could not share it on the screen.
Thank you very, very much, Moses, I think, for the comprehensive presentation. There are a lot of learning points there, which also builds on what is being shared by the colleagues in previous presentations. We are running out of time. So we have Professor Otiv Ibuza, who is going to share the Nigerian case study. Dr. Otiv, are you here?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, Doc, can you just do it, please, in 9 minutes?
9 minutes, I'll try.
Please go ahead. So, Dr.
So
Otiv,
thank you.
the founding executive director. Okay, I was just introducing you briefly.
Okay.
Is the founding executive director of the African Leadership and Development Center in Nigeria. So over to you, Dr. Otiv.
Thank you very much, Gam. Thank you for the opportunity to participate in the research and make this presentation. The Nigerian case study, what I want to do is just to give a background to Nigeria and the National Assembly, look at what are the provisions in the Nigerian Constitution with regard to oversight during emergencies, and then I will zero down on the COVID-19 crisis and legislative effectiveness. I will also talk briefly about the impact of the COVID-19 on the National Assembly, the intervention by Parliament in response to the pandemic, and make a few recommendations. Now, as a background, Nigeria operates a federal system of government with a federal government, just like what the Gambia mentioned, but Nigeria is bigger with 36 states and the Federal Capital Territory and 774 local government areas. Parliament in Nigeria at the national level is a bicameral parliament. It's a bicameral National Assembly made up of the upper house, the Senate, and the lower house, the House of Reps. The House of Reps the Senate has 109 senators, and the House of Reps has 360 members of the House of Representatives. Now, there are 36 states of the Federation, and those 36 states also have their own houses of assembly. But the houses of assembly at the state level is unicameral. And the Constitution provides for the legislative powers of both at the national level and at the state level. And now we all know that the key functions of the legislature are lawmaking, oversight, and representation. But in Nigeria, in terms of the constitutional provision for during emergencies, the president is empowered by the Constitution to proclaim a state of emergency in any part of the country where there is danger of war, when there is breakdown of law and order and public safety, or where there is disaster or natural calamity or any other public danger. But the presidential declaration is subject to approval of 2/3 majority of the entire National Assembly, and the declaration loses validity in 6 months. So it had to be renewed after every 6 months, which is similar to what my colleague mentioned about renewals in the Gambia. But in terms of the COVID-19 crisis and legislative effectiveness in Nigeria, there is a colonial law in Nigeria, the Quarantine Act of 1926, which provides for intervention on health emergencies in the country. It specifically provides for preventing the introduction into and spread in Nigeria and transmission from Nigeria of dangerous infectious diseases. So the president relied on this colonial law of 1926 to intervene in the COVID-19. So that is what the president used to issue the COVID-19 regulations 2020, which gave the president the power to issue orders for lockdown, for banning public assembly, and other regulations that guided COVID-19 to ensure that there is social, fiscal and social distancing and all of that. But under the act, I think this is the important thing, the president is not required to obtain legislative approval for emergencies designed to control the spread of dangerous diseases. Now, during the COVID-19 period, it has a lot of impact on the National Assembly in Nigeria. First, the National Assembly, like other institutions, were locked down. So they could no longer meet, and do their legislative business. Secondly, the citizen participation in the legislative process through public hearing was seriously affected. They had to limit the number of people that will come for public hearing, and in some cases insisted that citizen participation has to be through Zoom and other technology-aided devices, which disenfranchises a lot of people because a lot of the poor cannot have access to such things. Thirdly, the number of bills that was introduced during the period of COVID compared to other periods was very low. So the COVID-19 has a lot of negative impact on the work of the National Assembly in terms of its legislative work of lawmaking, oversight, and representation. However, the Parliament tried to respond to the pandemic. First, there were motions and resolutions on different aspects of the pandemic, whether to beef up security, evacuation of Nigerians from other countries, or flights from high-risk countries, or donation to COVID-19 response. So a lot of the legislators made donation or part of their salaries for the COVID-19 response. Secondly, there was the initiation of a new bill to replace the Colonial Law of Quarantine Act of 1926, which was titled Control of Infectious Diseases Bill 2020. But the bill was very, very controversial because it gave a lot of draconian powers to the executive, which a lot of citizens felt encroach on the rights of citizens. So there was a lot of opposition against the bill and it was not passed. There was also the economic stimulus bill, which is similar to the stimulus bills across the world, to make provisions for different aspects of support to citizens, different aspects of support to businesses, especially businesses that were really affected by the COVID-19. In addition, there was a supplementary appropriation bill, which was to deal specifically by the challenge 2020, to deal specifically with the challenges that were raised by the COVID-19. And then finally, there is a move for constitutional amendment to allow for virtual conduct of judicial proceedings in both criminal and civil matters. But this is still an ongoing thing. If it succeeds in the current constitutional review process, then that will be a phenomenal response to the COVID-19 pandemic. So, to conclude, I give two clear recommendations. First is that the Parliament will need to really devise ways to utilize more to utilize more technology to ensure citizens' engagement. Because during the period of COVID-19, citizen engagement decreased tremendously. Secondly, there will be the need to review laws from time to time. I'm sure it's the COVID-19 that made government to go back to look at what laws does it have powers to intervene, that they had to resort to the Quarantine Act of 1926. I think it's important for the Nigerian Parliament to look at all the laws in its books and look at those who are colonial laws so that they can be reviewed to reflect current realities. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Dr. Otif. I think the picture is emerged from all the case studies that we have had so far. And thank you for your very, interesting presentation for Nigeria. Without wasting much time, I understand, it's now lunchtime and even past lunchtime for different people in different zones.
It's not yet lunch time in Nigeria. We're just 12 noon.
Oh yeah, it's breakfast time there.
Yes, and breakfast time in Gambia as well.
Ah, wonderful. So Jane, I will give you a time during plenary, and for now, let's move to Professor Love Momaduku, who is the lead researcher. Professor Love Momaduku is a constitutional law expert from Zimbabwe. So, Prof, can you take over and just share the broader findings and recommendations? Maybe you can also share some experiences from Zimbabwe as well.
Thank you very much. I need to first also thank my colleagues who have given excellent overviews. And what I intend to do is to take up the broad framework, and then I think to colleagues and others, when they get to look at the report which summarizes this, the written report, they will then be able to find the kind of issues that they may need to comment on and correct here and there, where I do give examples of the other countries or the other nations that are around. But my starting point, which I find, and I think it's important across, is to start from the principle of separation of powers, which I think must influence the outcome of our report. It must also influence the outcome of our study. And so I will start on separation of powers, and I will end on separation of powers when it comes to recommendations. And indeed, what my colleagues have been doing, somewhat without saying it, it touches on that. Let me remind you what the principle of separation of powers is all about, and you'll see that it will give us answers to all the challenges that have arisen owing to COVID-19. Separation of powers in its simplest form says that state power, which is the power of the state, must be separated. It cannot be exercised by one organ. It can only be exercised appropriately and for the benefit of society if and only if it is exercised by three organs, namely a legislature, that is for legislating, an executive, that is for executing and implementing laws, and a judiciary. Now that if you want your society to move, this has nothing to do with the crisis or emergency. Society is created to be run in a crisis, to be run in an emergency, to be run under normal times. So separation of powers wants governance at all times to take recognition of the three central pillars of our processes. So even in an emergency, we must ensure that there are those three organs. But let me move on and say that separation of powers also recognizes that there can be what we call checks and balances, meaning that sometimes one organ tries to do or check on the powers of the other and vice versa to create what is called the balance of power, so that you need to move from there. Now, in our experience, this whole study, and I must start with that first conclusion that we make, and is emphasized without necessarily using the same words by all the presenters. This study shows that when it came to a crisis, only one organ was sacrificed adversely. That one organ is Parliament. That one organ is the legislature. There is no question that the executive during this crisis remained the executive. In fact, what we got from all the country studies is that the executive got much more power than would ordinarily be the power that it must have under a normal situation. The courts were not necessarily taken out of their framework. No one took away judicial power excessively. There could have been some limitation of access by the people to the courts, but there was no one and no organ thought of interfering with the work of the courts. But yet it was very clear that there was an interference with the work of Parliament. Now, why is that the case? Why do we find that of the three organs, if there's to be any complaint, of the three organs, it is Parliament that lost out It is Parliament that was caught flat-footed. It is Parliament that had to adjust, but not the other. If a president was operating like we get, you saw what happened in Gambia, what happened in Nigeria, what happened in Zimbabwe, what happened in South Africa, in almost every situation that I have mentioned, and even what happened in Kenya, there was a presidential declaration of sorts relying on some law that would be applying in that country. Meaning that those who were in the executive, they enjoyed very much the power to act unilaterally or the power to act without accountability or immediate accountability. Now, I want to answer the question, why was it that almost everywhere parliaments were somewhat affected by the crisis? In other words, the separation of powers doctrine was affected insofar as legislating is concerned. The reason which we find in all these studies is that Parliament itself undermined itself. Parliament undermined itself in two ways. The first way in which parliaments undermined themselves in all places is that they already had in place laws that would allow some of these actions to take place. No one invented a new law to actually act. The president had a law already made. It might be the Quarantine Act in Nigeria. It might be the Disaster Management Act in South Africa. It might be the Public Health Act in Zimbabwe. You can keep on naming these. These laws were already in place. These laws were not made for COVID. Parliament had already made laws ahead of time that in the event of this happening, in the event of that happening, you shall do this. I mean, the typical example is the Nigerian Quarantine Act. One asks themselves, why was that act still there? It's a 1926 legislation, but it was still there and it was found readily useful by the executive when it came to the COVID-19. So my first answer there, which I find from the studies, that Parliament had undermined itself by already leaving laws in place that could be utilized to undermine parliamentary democracy or parliamentary involvement. The second way in which Parliament undermined itself was that it had no initiative to take matters into its own hands once the situation unraveled. And we find that almost in all these places, when the first lockdowns were announced, Parliament itself was locked down, and that there was not much complaint around. I have seen one or two examples where Parliament tried to be quite proactive. And one such example, I think, took place in Kenya, where the Senate there established an ad hoc committee around March, right at the beginning of the COVID-19 situation. So they tried to be proactive, but they belong to the category of a few places where Parliament tried to then say, look, this is what has happened. We will not allow the executive to do or get away with things. We will come in and intervene. And that was very rarely done. But having said that, I would want to move to the overview of the findings that we made in terms of the framework, what Parliament was able to do or was unable to do, in terms of the kind of innovations that parliaments adopted, and all these things, I would really want to make them clear there. So I would start from the fact of providing or answering the question whether or not Parliament was able to perform its traditional roles during this COVID-19 period. The traditional roles of Parliament are basically three. They are in three main categories. We can add others. The first one is lawmaking. The second one is an oversight role, where Parliament does ensure accountability of the executive, accountability of other institutions, or monitoring the work of other organs. And then the third aspect of traditional role of Parliament is Parliament providing a framework for being a national forum for the consideration of public issues. Now, in respect of all these three traditional roles, it is very clear in terms of our study that in the first 4 months of the COVID-19 pandemic outbreak, Parliament failed, and parliaments across the Africa failed to play any meaningful role in respect of these three aspects. These are issues that I illustrate in full in the report, but it's also confirmed by the presentations that have been given. In other words, if you want to answer the question, was Parliament able to continue legislating? The answer is no. Was Parliament able to really do an effective oversight role during the first 4 or 5 months? The answer is no. Was Parliament able to become a platform where we could have national debate, where we could have the issues of public interest debated? Again, the answer is no, because in many of those places, Parliament itself was not sitting. So I would say that in the first few months of parliamentary, as of the COVID-19, parliamentary business was clearly largely affected. If I were to rate that, over 90% of parliamentary work was almost lost, almost non-existent during that period. So I would make that then the 10%. But after the first 5 months, there were visible changes in many places, but not all. The most outstanding, and I would want, with due respect, to use that as an example of the most outstanding intervention by Parliament, which would meet the kind of expectation in terms of the roles that we have set up. That took place in South Africa. The South African Parliament, in fact, the South African framework, reacted rather ably to the COVID-19 situation. It was more in South Africa where the parliamentary processes quickly moved to what are now obviously clearly known as hybrid sessions. We start with virtual sessions, the hybrid session where you would have some members are in the sitting, physical sitting, and other members are following proceedings virtually, and they can be. This quickly took place in South Africa. But even then, the South African rules relating to how to conduct virtual sittings were promulgated quite early during that period. I think if one looks at the presentation that has been very much given, and the presentation that has been given by a colleague from South Africa, shows that as early as about end of April 2020, those rules had been adopted. My study shows that in the other countries, it took quite a longer period for Parliament to come up with rules. In some places, they took up to a year, in fact, at the beginning of this year, to be able to have some rules that were tailored to meet the COVID situation. So if we have to have an assessment, we would say that Parliament's failure in the first few months to perform its traditional roles was largely due not so much to the ineffectiveness or incompetence of parliaments. It was due, and this is another finding we make in our study, due to the legal framework for the operation of Parliament. All my colleagues have made reference to the constitutional structures or the constitutional framework in which Parliament operates. That legal and constitutional framework makes it almost impossible for Parliament to react quickly. I'll give examples now. For the traditional roles require that Parliament must sit, what we call a sitting of Parliament. And a sitting of Parliament traditionally conceived was a physical sitting. Now it took some time to adjust and make Parliament sit virtually. But even up to now, there's not a single country that still allows Parliament to sit virtually throughout, in other words, to be all sittings to be virtual. Countries still have a hybrid situation where some members, including the Speaker and others, ought to be physically sitting somewhere in the seat of parliament. So one problem was the legal setting, which says you must have a specific sitting, and that could not be adjusted. Some of these frameworks are put in the constitution, and constitutions are not flexible documents, so you could not easily do that. The second issue, which is of a legal nature, is what is called a quorum. You must have a quorum for any sitting of parliament, the minimum number. And then that minimum number would be a minimum number physically. When virtual sittings were introduced, it became even very difficult to tell whether or not a member was
Hello? Professor Maduku? It appears he has lost connection.
to do with the legal.
Oh, okay. We lost you a bit, Prof. Hello, are you there? Right, he has dropped.
Hello?
Okay, now we can hear you.
Yes, I don't know where you lost. You might have lost a few words.
Okay, no, it's fine. You can proceed.
Okay, let me continue. Okay. Now, I want to move to I think I've made that first fundamental finding that we make, that Parliament was caught flat-footed. Parliaments failed across, and then there were parliaments that were quickly able to rise from where they had fallen. And I gave the example of South Africans, that they moved faster than the rest of the parliaments around. And then we got some parliaments that tried, like the Kenyans, but that appears from my reading, both of the papers and my own study, that the executive did quickly stifle some of the initiatives that parliament wanted to do in the Kenyan situation. Then I think in other countries, there was so much of parliaments wanting to follow what the executive wanted. I can give the example of my own country in Zimbabwe. Parliament generally just followed the executive. Whatever the executive was doing is what parliament wanted to be done, and so forth. Then, so you'd get situation, what emergency frameworks and how those frameworks compare with the rest. What we find happening is that in terms of law, Parliament is allowed to delegate certain powers to the executive, and that the delegated powers to the executive were the ones which were used by the executive to move on. What was apparent in this, in our studies, and the conclusions that I think we must draw, is that the executive exploited the framework offered by COVID to actually gain more power than what had been contemplated by Parliament. Almost invariably, the executive abused the power given to them. They used the COVID situation to actually realize that they can do without Parliament. And this is the danger that came out from the situations that were there. You would find that if the executive can proceed in the name of an emergency to do certain things without Parliament, then what can stop the executive still doing the same even outside the crisis? So you would see, therefore, that the extensions of the emergency legislation, there was no parliamentary consultation. Many of the continuations of a state of emergency or a state of crisis or a health crisis were always at the instance of the executive deciding that they will extend. But most of those extensions were now done with other objectives in mind. And I find there that Parliament failed to deal with the situation, to control, in other words, take back the power that had been given to the executive. For this, I want to draw the attention of all of us to the fact that there were so many problems that arose from COVID-19 related procurement or COVID-19 related tenders and so forth, which in some countries, ministers of health couldn't continue in office. Not in one or two, it's more than 2 countries where those problems arose. It was so clear that without parliamentary oversight, without parliament playing its role of providing a debating framework for issues, the executive tends to clearly overdo its framework. And the question that we need to address is there such a crisis or an emergency where the role of parliament can be regarded as secondary? Our answer is clearly no. There can never be a crisis or an emergency where the role of parliament can actually be made secondary or less important than the role of the executive. There is no democratic justification for the fact that in a crisis, defer to the executive, because after all, it is parliament that is normally directly elected in all this. And the executive gets its direct election in many cases because of an election of the head of the executive, if we have a direct election of the president. So we discover and find out from our study that there was an extensive abuse of the power that had been delegated by parliament to the executive, and that the executive didn't realize the extent to which it was undermining parliament. Now, the solution to this comes from the fact that all these things were done in a manner that I can say from the conclusions that I can draw myself. It's not coming from any of the presentations because that point was not addressed. It appears to me, and it's a conclusion I will make, that the extent of delegation that was given to the executive during the COVID-19 is actually unconstitutional and illegal in many of these countries. I say so because in every constitution, there is, if not expressly put, there is an implied provision that says that parliament shall not delegate its powers in such a way that that delegation amounts to an abdication of responsibility. I'll pick examples of countries that say that although parliament can delegate, it shall not. In Zimbabwe, you have a provision in the constitution, section 134, that says that parliament shall not delegate its primary lawmaking function. Now, that provision is as explicit as that in the Kenyan constitution. Although they don't put it that way, they make it very clear in Kenya that whenever parliament wants to delegate certain positions, it must be very precise in the extent of the delegation, how it is doing it, and for what reasons that delegation has been given. In South Africa, although it is not stated in express terms, their constitutional court there has actually made it clear that certain things cannot be delegated to the executive. But if we look at the amount of delegation that took place during COVID-19, my conclusion, and I'm going to firm up on that conclusion by reading more closely some of the provisions of all the countries that have reported, is that there has been an extensive delegation which actually can be argued to be contrary to the constitutions of those countries. I mean, if you look at that Nigerian situation, where parliament then tried to amend or to pass to replace this old law, the Quarantine Act, what you then get there is that the attempts by parliament, the bills that had been proposed to replace that, it was shot down. And then that bill was never passed into law, meaning that there would have been an attempt on the part of the executive just to enjoy things as they. So I must make that clear that as far as the delegation in legislative framework is concerned, that was contrary, I think, to the spirit of the processes that are contemplated in the Constitution. I want to move to another aspect which is what we discover about whether there were measures taken and the extent of the scope of the measures taken. The most prominent measure taken by Parliament and what one can call an innovation is the so-called virtual meetings, which, as we have seen, in some places there were hybrid sessions where Parliament could meet virtually, but then also where Parliament could conduct its business with persons, public participation virtually. This was an important innovation which must be continued, but it had serious democratic deficits, serious democratic problems, in the sense that public participation therefore became a preserve of an elite group that could access virtual facilities, or that could understand Zoom, or that could participate in parliamentary sessions via social media platforms created by Parliament. What was lacking in many of the countries, except in a few, was access to television and the broadcasting of parliamentary sessions. But then the access to television right across Africa is still extremely limited. Even in the countries where there is prominent television coverage, the majority of the people there still did not participate in parliamentary processes because of the lack of access. So yes, virtual meetings, but virtual meetings still with highly limited public participation. And that highly limited public participation requires more innovations, as I shall shortly demonstrate in terms of the recommendation that we would propose that they be given. Then I wish to move again to the question of whether in fact Parliament was able to play an oversight way and what oversight frameworks were devised during this period. With COVID-19, there were enough frameworks for Parliament to be more innovative in how it could be able to monitor the work of the executive. The executive is used to going to Parliament. That's how the executive operates. We go to Parliament. When they go to Parliament, they know which MPs would be able to deal with matters and so forth. What we discover, it was done in a very limited manner, is a situation where some reports were given to parliamentary committees. In other words, parliamentary committees working at home, working in various sessions, can always demand on a day-to-day basis reports, or on a weekly basis reports from their departments that they are supposed to have an oversight on. This area is an area that could be developed in terms of how it could be done. But we found that it was limited in scope, and in fact, there is no single report of that having happened, although there was scope for it. Where parliamentary committees, via an understanding with the executive, that we will now monitor you through these measures, then those measures are adopted, then they are implemented. The greatest weakness that we found in our research, at least from the conclusions I draw, is the question of who takes the initiative to make Parliament tick. What does it take to say Parliament is now meeting? The weakness of all the countries that parliamentary sessions, except in Kenya and in South Africa, parliamentary sessions are at the instance of the executive. The two countries I've singled out, Kenya and South Africa, I have not been able to find out, I'm sure I'll be corrected in terms of the Nigerian thing, I'm still trying to peruse through. But in the other countries, I'm very certain and very clear that parliamentary sessions or parliamentary responses don't happen without the executive initiating that. In other words, Parliament is called to a session by the executive. Parliamentary business is created by the executive. In other words, there's parliamentary business because the executive wants Parliament to act. There is parliamentary business because there is some initiative from an executive organ of state. It might be the ministry that is charged with the responsibility of supervising parliamentary affairs and so forth. This is the greatest weakness. And then it's even weaker, much weaker in countries that have some strange arrangements of how speakers of parliament come into being. I mean, the typical example is what we had, and I read that and found that I think we heard very clearly from Gambia, where the speaker and the deputy speaker, and speaker, they come from the 5 members who are nominated into parliament by the president. So it's clearly an example of where the executive leads parliament, what you find in Gambia. And then in that case, it would mean that the parliamentary role is left to the executive to initiate. I hope people are getting my point. I want to make that because to be prominent in the paper. Who takes the initiative to make parliament respond to issues? Does parliament wait for the executive to then tell it when to start and so on? In Zimbabwe, for example, when parliament adjourns, parliamentary sessions and so on, those dates are determined not in writing, but clearly in practice and practically so by the executive. It is the executive that knows when parliament is sitting. It is the executive that knows when next parliament is coming. And so you have executive dominance of when parliament reacts. We got that, if I give a further example again in Zimbabwe, quite a strange situation. Parliament itself for the first 6 or 7 months of the pandemic was not even able to conduct its business. And then eventually Parliament was then regarded as an essential service, much later than what you find in other countries where Parliament was much earlier an essential service, regardless of the lockdown. So I want to leave that point hanging out prominently in terms of who initiates parliamentary sittings and so forth. Can I just quickly wind up and look at some of the areas of the recommendation? I think just the organizers of today's meeting realize most things will come out in the paper that we've done and so on. I want to rush to quickly look at the areas of the recommendation. The first recommendation that we make in the study, and I hope that is understood. The first recommendation is to say that there must be a clear message across Africa, which is as follows, that separation of powers cannot be suspended, whatever the circumstance. It doesn't matter whether it is raining, whether there is a war, whether there is whatever, you cannot suspend separation of powers. What this means, and this is an ideal that we put across, and it must be a recommendation to go all over Africa. You cannot suspend separation of powers. You cannot suspend the courts. You cannot suspend parliament. You cannot suspend the executive. So when we make that overall position, that separation of powers cannot be suspended, that it be a uniform position across Africa, we are simply making the message that you have to survive together. You have to act in the crisis together. So if a crisis comes, don't look for an opportunity to sideline another organ, which is what happened with COVID. There is COVID. Here we have an opportunity. Parliament can go to hell and so on. We can close that and so on. But I think that that message is coming. So that is the broad recommendation number 1. That will be clear there. It will then be followed by recommendation number 2, which is to say that Parliament's oversight role must be an hourly or a minute by minute function of Parliament. The way we are putting that recommendation to be properly formulated, it will be to say that you don't wait to meet, you don't wait to sit to be able to do oversight. That oversight by definition must be oversight of things that are happening. If the executive is working every day, if other institutions are working every day, then there must be an oversight every day. There must be an oversight every minute, and so forth. So what has to happen is that Parliament must ensure and understand that its oversight function of all the other functions is a minute by minute or an hour by hour or a day by day function, which is very clear. Then the third aspect is that parliaments must strengthen their initiative. By this, we mean that parliament must not wait to be logged on. The current framework is that parliaments across, they are logged on by the executive. And that is wrong. Of course, you have very good rules in many of the constitutions. You get that in South Africa, you get that in Kenya, you get that in the Zimbabwean constitution. You get that even in the Nigerian constitution. It's very clear there that parliament will determine its own session. But that doesn't happen in practice. In practice, that parliament waits to be logged on. So we would make recommendations on the initiatives, and then I think this will require that the position of the Speaker of Parliament be somewhat uniformly be understood what it entails and what a Speaker of Parliament can do. We have countries where the Speaker is not a member of Parliament. He is the head of Parliament, yes, but has not very limited role to move on and so on. So that recommendation would be made. Then fourthly, we want to recommend that there be model hybrid, let's put them as hybrid sittings, a model hybrid sittings regulations. In other words, the SADC PF or the Parliamentary Forum in the whole of Africa and so on. We must come up with a model set of rules of how to conduct virtual or hybrid sittings of Parliament, and that be clearly set out there. In these model hybrid rules, or we can call them model hybrid standing orders, they must clearly put specifics that will cover what we call public participation in parliamentary business and so forth. It must be clear how Parliament relates with the public, etc. Then the fifth recommendation relates to Parliament must expand its tools of engagement with the public. This is something that does a lot of impact, because when we had COVID, the meetings with members of the public were obviously stopped, or there were not interactions. Of course, Parliament came up with rules of how they would screen people for meetings and so on. There must be, I think, an expansion of the sort of tools that can be used in how we relate and regulate our relationship. We have some countries that have radio programs where members of the public can phone in. In other words, if a member of Parliament, what can be called constituents work, might be to go to a central place, a community radio station in the constituents, and start engaging with members of the public and so forth in terms of how that is to be done. Then I would also say that we have to realize in the kind of recommendations we are giving that our definition of a crisis must be reviewed. The mere fact that something is a healthy crisis, it is not a crisis for purposes of constitutionalism, for purposes of the rule of law, and for purposes of entrenching democracy. That is not a crisis, because as I said at the beginning, a crisis is merely one way in which life has to go on. Now, I think these are the summaries that I would have wanted to give. I would want to stop at this stage, organizers, if there's anything I can add, but this is what I have in my notes. The rest you get in the paper.
Thank you very much, Professor Maduku. That was very, very comprehensive and, very sound recommendations that you are making there. Let me not spoil the presentation by commenting further, but at this point, invite my co-director of ceremony, Mr. Kurasha, to take us to the plenary and the closing.
Thank you very much, Mr. Matenga. Honorable members, our resource persons, distinguished participants, we wish to open for discussion and questions before we conclude. And at this juncture, I would invite honorable members and participants to indicate if they want to take the floor. Depending on the response, we are going to have 5 participants in each set of questions, and then we allow the resource persons to respond. Honorable members, distinguished participants, the floor is open. I see Honorable Nasmendo. Commissioner. You have the floor, Honorable Nasmendo. You are muted. Honorable Nasmendo, you are muted.
Muito obrigada, Sr. Curacha. Começo por saudar a todos os presentes. Gostaria, em primeiro lugar, aproveitar esta oportunidade que me dá para saudar a todas as pessoas que falaram, portanto, que expuseram os seus pontos de vista sobre a questão da Covid. Saudar e felicitar pelas brilhantes comunicações que foram feitas, e gostaria de aproveitar para dizer que Angola também está entre os países que têm tomado todas as medidas sobre a Covid-19, em conjunto com o Parlamento. Em Angola, a Covid começou em março de 2020, logo a seguir, e depois de ouvido o Parlamento, foi criada uma comissão interministerial que se ocupou de todo este trabalho, e foram feitas uma série de demarches, tal como os outros países explicaram. Eu não vou aqui explicar detalhadamente como foi, mas depois foi decretado o estado de emergência, foram postas as cercas sanitárias, mas gostaria de dizer que todas estas atividades que o Executivo fez foi sempre ouvido o Parlamento. Também existe uma comissão parlamentar que se ocupa da questão da Covid e que trabalha estreitamente com o Executivo e que permanentemente, sempre que necessário, vêm ao Parlamento informar os parlamentares do que está a ser feito, de como está a ser feito, quais as dificuldades que se têm encontrado, como se sanam essas dificuldades, e enfim, neste momento, eu gostaria de dizer que Angola está na fase de vacinação de toda a população. Angola está a vacinar, neste momento, desde as cidades até as aldeias. A nossa pretensão é vacinar toda a população até março de 2022. Portanto, neste momento, nós estamos nesta fase, e eu gostaria também de ter a possibilidade de ter todas essas comunicações que foram feitas, porque os países têm experiências muito interessantes que é preciso acompanhar, conhecer e ver como é que pode ser o intercâmbio entre os países, de modo a que, de facto, consigamos funcionar todos em conjunto. A pandemia deixou muitos problemas, trouxe muitos problemas, tanto a nível da sociedade, de um modo geral, empresários, foi preciso encerrar escolas, foi preciso tudo isso, e então eu creio que nós devemos, em conjunto, ver as formas como podemos ultrapassar todas essas dificuldades. Gostei muito de ouvir aqui a experiência do Zimbábue, daquilo que foi dito sobre as questões da pandemia, as recomendações que foram feitas, tenho-nas aqui para serem tidas em atenção, e gostaria, se fosse possível, de facto, fornecerem-nos depois por via e-mail todas essas comunicações que foram feitas. Felicito mais uma vez a todos e agradeço a SADC por estas reuniões que se têm feito e que nos munem de muitos conhecimentos. Muito obrigado.
Muito obrigado. Thank you very much, Honorable Nascimento, for always being the first to share the Angolan story.
Felicitações, já está a falar português. Thank you.
Thank you, Honorable. And I was commending you for always be the first to share the Angolan story. Whenever we are in a meeting and you take the floor, I've listened carefully how you are always the first one to share the experiences of Angola. We really appreciate. We undertake to make sure that the presentations from all the researchers, as well as the final report, will be shared with honorable members and participants. I wish to receive any further questions, comments, before we give our rapporteurs, our resource persons to respond. I don't seem to see any further hands. That suggests that we have no questions, and the participants have followed the presentations and have clearly associated with the observations and the recommendations. At this juncture, before I move to close the meeting, I wish to invite any of the presenters, in particular, Professor Maduk, if you have any comments following the submissions by Angola.
Yes, Shaunes, I think I can make a comment. I must have missed that my translation, I was playing around with this so I couldn't get what was being said there. I'm sorry about that, unless there's something that is quite clear, which I can respond to from you if you just tell me what.
There wasn't a question per se, it was comments, but particularly she was sharing the Angolan experience, which resonates with what has emerged from the other countries in terms of how Parliament responded by establishing a interparliamentary committee and other measures to make sure that Parliament remain operational during COVID.
Actually, that's fine. So I'm not surprised by that. In fact, my experience, like I've shared, is that, I think parliaments acted more or less in the same way. And I think our recommendations will work across the board.
Sure.
All right.
At this juncture, allow me to then deliver closing remarks on the back of the clear recommendations that were put forward by the team. I wish to indicate that both SADC-PF and International IDEA, in the context of our collaboration, continue to make sure that we generate platforms where we can exchange knowledge, experiences, and benchmark. And in this context, we shall proceed to finalize the report, which will be a study that will serve as a knowledge tool to assist member parliaments to be ready in terms of dealing with future crises. I wish to, at this juncture, end by recalling the words of the president of current president of Seychelles, himself a former member of SADC-PF, and in particular chairperson of the Standing Committee on Democratization, Governance and Human Rights. He indicated that, and I quote, "For us as parliamentarians, times of crisis are critical moments when we rise and assume a central role in the governance of our countries. Citizens look up to us as their elected representatives to make sure that their voices are heard and reflected in decision-making and policy implementation. Through the representation, lawmaking, and oversight functions, Parliament are duty-bound to make sure that executive actions during the COVID-19 pandemic remain within the limits of the national constitutions and international human rights law. Whatever the mode of lockdown our individual countries are implementing, parliaments must ensure that democracy is not locked down, and that there is a balance between measures for health and safety on one hand and the protection of fundamental human rights on the other hand. This resonates with the first recommendation that came from the researchers, namely that whatever the circumstances, the principle of separation of powers must not be compromised. So our starting point must be to say what role should Parliament play and make sure that we put in place the necessary frameworks that facilitate for Parliament's action, drawing lessons from the COVID-19 pandemic. It is a matter of fact, as already discussed, that there were different reactions. Some parliaments were proactive, some were found to resort to knee-jerk reactions. And we need to draw lessons and ensure that going forward, we develop the framework that will assist national parliaments so that whatever crisis we face in the future, it could be related to cyber issues, it could be related to economic crisis, we need to make sure that parliaments are responsive. One of the things that became very apparent during this COVID-19 pandemic is the reality of the rural-urban divide in terms of access to infrastructure, including the ICT. And we saw how members of parliament who come from rural constituencies were struggling during meetings. We also continue to experience challenges with members of parliament from across our countries when they should attend to meetings such as the one we are having. And this speaks to the reality of our situation. I've often remarked that COVID-19 in some respect did not create new problems. It only came to exacerbate or to accentuate problems that were already in existence. It gave us an opportunity to be able to, while locked down, to observe the reality of the challenges the most vulnerable parts of our population face. And this must be a matter of concern for parliaments, because parliament, as we know, is the representative institution of our democracy, but more importantly is also the home of social contract. We must make sure that democratic accountability is always upheld. At this juncture, allow me to declare the meeting officially closed. Thank you very much. Obrigado, merci. And we will be in communication with regards to sharing the documents as has been undertaken. Have a good day. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Honorable Namachekeja, Muribanji.
Ndio mulibanja imwene zingenda bwinotu. Mwendesa bwino kwa basi.
Have a good day. Sure.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
ICT, you can terminate.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you so much. SG, we see you. How are you?
Thank you, everyone.
Goodbye, everyone, and thank you. It's a pleasure.
Thank you as well. Goodbye.
ICT? Yes,